Hi everyone, this is my video lecture on Barsky's ethical decision-making model. I introduced it a little bit on the online forum where I talked about kind of the importance of having a decision-making model. This is not the gold standard, you have to do this one. This is just a very logical and useful one that I tend to like. And it just gives you a framework for being able to explore what to do in situations where there are ethical issues at play. So I'm going to walk you through this. And again, keep in mind, this is not required for every time you face an ethical dilemma. It just serves as a framework and model. All right, let me see if I can get my computer. Okay, so this is the 6 steps. I'm going to skip over the screen because I'm going to walk through each one individually, but you can see there's arrows going all over the place. What you'll find is you might have step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it in a perfect world, well, in a perfect world, we wouldn't have ethical dilemmas. Let's be upfront right there. But in a perfect ethical decision-making model world, you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and be done. However, this model is really designed to circle back to other steps if new problems or considerations or evidence or whatever comes into play. You might be on step 4, but then have to go back to step 2 because you have to consult a lawyer this time versus just your supervisor. So the arrows are all over the place to kind of show that this is not a linear model. It is often rather circular. So we're going to start with step 1. Oh, forgot this slide was in here. I did link this as a handout on Sakai. I think this is really helpful to print out if possible because you'll be able to use this for your thesis paper when you're working on your case study. This shows you how to walk through each step and what each step entails or could entail. So this is just the screen print of it. The actual PDF is linked on the week 3 online module. And that will be a really, really helpful tool to keep on hand. All right, stage 1 is essentially identifying what the ethical issue is. This is done by being aware of what relevant laws are, what your agency considers to be ethical or moral, or like a rule that's in place. And obviously we have the Code of Ethics, which is kind of the Bible of ethics for social workers. And so when we kind of have that tension, I always call it like if your gut is telling you something's off, then there's probably something worth exploring. And the important part about this stage is that you want to identify things as early as possible. The longer you drag it on, the more, I don't want to say trouble, but the more murky it gets and the more vulnerable you become yourself as a professional, because obviously we're looking at doing least harm to our clients, but there's also a professional implication when we do something and don't necessarily address an ethical issue. It can come back and fall on us, even though we might not necessarily have done the ethical violation. Not addressing the problem early on can contribute to the problem, and it can put our licenses in jeopardy. So you want to just address it as soon as possible, both for the sake of the client and for yourself. And you really want to articulate the specific issue. So if we're looking at the next slide, we want to not just be like, hey, I think confidentiality was breached. That's a little vague. You really want to define what exactly happened. Like, what are the client's rights? What rights are being violated? And why is this an ethical issue? And that will really help you as you go through the next stages because it gives you a specific target to focus on. If you watch the video linked in the module about moral reasoning, it does talk about how often we address dilemmas with our emotions. And so if we know a little bit about the brain, and we've talked about like catastrophizing and distorted thinking, that sometimes we might be looking at a situation through our emotions, so we don't necessarily have a good logical factual grasp on what we're trying to address. So this stage is really forcing you to kind of go into that more logical brain versus the emotional brain to be really like, okay, concrete and objective. Like, this is what happened. This is the ethical violation. So once you've clearly defined what what ethical issue is happening, what right is being violated. You want to determine appropriate help. You are not meant to solve ethical dilemmas on your own, and actually it's very ill-advised to try to address them on your own because, again, like if you're looking at it through the lens of your worldview or your life experiences or emotions, you might not be able to look at the full picture, and it just helps for accountability. Having an objective third party kind of step in is going to help protect you as a social worker, but also protect the clients as well. Like, I think about like if you have a history of domestic violence or it's an issue that's really close to home, if you encounter a situation where you might suspect domestic violence or someone's being abused, it might trigger something in you. And yes, that's an ethical and a human right violation. But you might not be able to see objectively and be able to help in the best way possible. So pulling in somebody else is going to help you. So you really want to identify what type of help might be most useful. If you're working in a clinic setting, your supervisor usually is the best person to go to. That kind of trickles into bullet point number 2, like who's appropriate, what might be useful, are kind of essentially the same thing. But usually starting with your supervisor is a good place. Jumping to maybe like legal counsel or the insurance agency or something might not be how your agency, like the flow of things is, especially if it's an internal issue involving like higher ups in your agency. It's always best to go to the supervisor because that's like your most direct contact, and they'll be able to help you identify, okay, this is an HR thing. This is a corporate compliance. This is a license report thing. They're going to help you be able to navigate that much better. So kind of identifying that first point of contact. You will actually find this here. Here's a little fun fact tip that might help you in the future if you take your licensing exam to get fully licensed for social work. If there's ever a question where they're like, what should you do first? And if there is on the multiple choice, the option to say, consult with supervisor, that is always the right answer. Like, even if it's not what you really do, you always consult with your supervisor first. So that will help you on the licensing exam, but it also relates very directly to our decision-making model. So once you've determined the appropriate help and gone to them, this is the opportunity for you to think critically around the situation. And so you really have, this is like where self-awareness comes in. You got to know what kind of biases you're coming in with, kind of where your values are at and motivations. You just got to be able to know what you're bringing to the table. And that's why it's important to bring other people to the table, because they might have other values and beliefs and motivations that might conflict with yours. But it will be able to give you a more broad picture. You want to look at all of the different angles. And so that's going to be able to help you with that. So again, considering multiple perspectives, have someone play devil's advocate, like play it from like if you feel very strongly on one end and someone else is feeling strongly on the other, have those discussions, bring them out. Don't get offended. You really have to have open-mindedness when you're in this sort of thinking critical stage, because obviously you want to be right. Like, I want to be right all the time. But I know, unfortunately, I am not right all the time. And so being humble enough to hear somebody else's perspective and not taking it personally if my viewpoint or perspective isn't the path that we go down, knowing that that's okay and that isn't necessarily a reflection on my clinical judgment or my personal beliefs. It's just all part of the process. And so you really want to define also what your goal is for this. And so the like annoying thing about ethics and ethical decisions and dilemmas, it is often not a black and white, like, oh, if you do A and then do B, you'll get C. Like, it's really, really hard and ambiguous. So having specific goals so you have like a point of accomplishment is really, really helpful. It's going to brainstorm ideas, look at the consequences of each idea, and weigh the obligations to your agency, to the client, to yourself, to your profession, all those fun things. This can be done individually or in a group, but the more you can at least have one person involved in the process with you at some touch point in this process, it's really best practice. So in this process, everybody might come to the same conclusion right away. It might be a no-brainer. It might be very obvious what everybody should do, or just everybody just happens to be in harmony on it, that would be great. You can really skip the 4th stage. We'll get to that obviously in a second. And you can go right into the planning and implementation of things. But other situations, you're not going to have a clear answer on what to do, and you're going to have to do some conflict resolution, which brings us to stage 4, which is managing conflict. I don't know why there's a number 5 under there, but cool. Okay, so that kind of goes back to thinking critically, where you want to define what your goals are. So if you find after thinking critically about things that you're still in conflict with each other, you want to revisit those goals and see where you're at and be like, what is our main objective here? How are conflicting views either upholding that objective, or how are they negating it and not necessarily fulfilling it? And so this is the not fun part, and this is where like the process can kind of get stalemated, and you might have to jump back to step 2 and figure out new consultation or new people getting involved. I mean, it's part of then conflict management. You might have to have HR come into play. Honestly, the NSAW has like ethical decision-making consults. Like there's people in place that if you have an issue, you can have them consulted and involved in the process. So you might have to get somebody so far removed to kind of get not necessarily a power play, but have a say that isn't necessarily feeding into like the agency or relationship dynamic you might be having with a person that you don't see eye to eye on. And you always want to look at the nature of the conflicts. Like, am I digging my heels in because I really don't like the person who has another perspective? Am I afraid of losing my job, or am I afraid of pissing off a client? Like, you got to figure out why you might be resistant to the other person's option, and vice versa. And it might just come down to like different values and perspectives on things. So the goal is at that point, after you've processed through the conflicts, and honestly, sometimes there comes a point where there's a stalemate and the agency kind of plays the trump card based on what agency policy is, or your supervisor plays the trump card because they are in the position of power. But ultimately, by the time you get to stage 5, it might be an ugly process or a great process. You want to plan and implement your decision. So you just want to figure out who's going to call who's going to do what, who's going to intervene where. You want to find strategies that are going to have the more success rate in protecting and promoting safety for your client, and promoting or monitoring implementation because you want to get things figured out before they get too problematic. Then stage 6, as all good social workers love to do, we want to evaluate, make sure that the interventions or the strategies were effective, and see if there's any follow-up needed down the road. And then also seeing if the process was effective in figuring out how to bring about change. So those are the 6 stages. The podcast that you have to listen to will give you kind of more insight on how to apply these. On paper, they sound really good, but once you start kind of getting into the nitty gritty of things, it can be hard to kind of process through it. And I love ethical dilemmas, but I hate being in the middle of an ethical dilemma because it's really, really difficult. I was really hoping to do this in person, but I plan to record probably an ethical decision making, or not, an ethical dilemma that I faced in my clinical practice, and kind of how we followed these steps without knowing, or we didn't follow these steps, and why we should have, because it would have made the process a lot smoother. These are 6 tenets of things that would be really helpful in the decision-making process. The handout I gave goes into them more in depth, and I'm going to let you review those on your own. But I think what you really want to take away from this is anytime that you're making a decision, you want to do no harm. Sometimes that's impossible, so you want to do the least harm. And so you are going to be faced with a choice that you're going to have to go through, like what is the least harmful for the person, or to the client, or the social worker, or the agency. And that's why this model is important, because it does help with liability. You have to figure out who you're doing the least harm to. So choosing one path might cause least harm to some, but greater harm to another. So it's kind of just processing through that all. And I'm short on time, So that is the